I need to tell you something about Gemini energy that almost no one is talking about. And the timing of this conversation is not accidental. We are moving through a period where Mercury, Gemini's ruling planet, is activating frequencies we haven't experienced in decades. And if you have any Gemini placements in your chart, or if you've been feeling an unusual mental restlessness lately, what I'm about to share will explain everything you've been experiencing. You might think you already know Gemini. The twins, the social butterfly, the one who can't make up their mind, the person at the party talking to everyone but connecting with no one. But I'm going to tell you right now that almost everything you've been taught about this sign is a surface-level misunderstanding that has caused profound pain for those carrying this energy. Have you noticed lately that your mind feels like it's moving at twice the speed it used to? That you're picking up on conversations, strange, right? Patterns, and connections that others seem to miss entirely? That you can hold to completely contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time and somehow both feel true? If you're nodding right now, you're already feeling what I'm talking about. This isn't confusion. This isn't indecisiveness. This is the activation of Gemini's true gift, and most people have been shamed for it their entire lives. Let me take you back to something fundamental that gets lost in pop astrology. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, the messenger god, the trickster, the one who moves between worlds. But here's what they don't tell you in the glossy horoscope columns. Mercury doesn't just rule communication. Mercury rules the liminal spaces, the thresholds, the places between one reality and another. Gemini energy is not about being scattered or superficial. Gemini energy is about having the cognitive flexibility to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to translate between different languages of experience, to see the connecting threads that others miss because they're too committed to a single viewpoint. Think about this for a moment. We live in a world that demands you pick a side, choose a lane, commit to one identity and never deviate. Be consistent. Be predictable. Be one thing so others can categorize you and feel comfortable. But Gemini comes into this world wired completely differently. The Gemini mind is designed to perceive multiplicity, to understand that truth is not singular but faceted, that every story has multiple valid interpretations, that the same person can contain contradictions and still be whole. This is not a flaw. This is not being two-faced. This is advanced consciousness operating in a world that hasn't caught up yet. But here's where the pain comes in. And I know you've felt this if you carry this energy from childhood. Gemini placements are told they're too much, too talkative, too curious, too changeable, can't focus, can't commit, can't be trusted because they see too many sides of every situation. The educational system punishes Gemini energy. The corporate world punishes Gemini energy. Even relationships punish Gemini energy because people want you to be the same person every single day. And Gemini knows that's a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe. So what happens? The Gemini native learns to perform. They learn to mirror. They become the social chameleon not because they're fake, but because they've been taught that their natural multiplicity is unacceptable. They learn to show people what they want to see, to speak the language that makes others comfortable, to hide the full spectrum of their intelligence because it makes people nervous. Does this resonate with you? Have you spent years of your life editing yourself down, making yourself smaller, pretending you don't see the contradictions and complexities that are obvious to you but invisible to everyone else? Let me tell you what's really happening beneath the surface. Gemini is a mutable air sign, which means it's designed for adaptation, for flow, for responding to changing conditions with mental agility. Air signs process reality through the intellect, through pattern recognition, through the exchange of ideas. But mutable energy means this isn't fixed or static. Gemini doesn't just think about things. Gemini thinks about thinking. Gemini observes the observer. This is metacognitive awareness operating at a level that most people never access. When you understand this, suddenly everything about Gemini makes sense. The reason Gemini gets bored easily isn't because they're shallow. It's because their mind processes information so quickly that they've already explored every angle of a topic before others have finished their first thought. The reason Gemini seems to change their mind isn't because they're unreliable. It's because they're actually updating their perspective based on new information, which is what intelligence looks like in real time. The reason Gemini can talk to anyone about anything isn't because they're performing or being fake. It's because they have the rare gift of code switching, of understanding that different people speak different languages of experience. And true communication requires meeting people where they are. But here's the shadow side that we need to talk about. Because Gemini energy can absolutely be misused, and understanding this is crucial. When Gemini operates from wounding rather than wholeness, when they're disconnected from their core truth, they can become exactly what the stereotypes suggest. They can become manipulative, using their gift of language to deceive rather than connect. They can become scattered, jumping from thing to thing not out of genuine curiosity but out of fear of depth. They can become performative, creating 100 different masks but losing touch with who they actually are underneath. This happens when Gemini energy is not grounded. Air signs need earth. They need embodiment. They need practices that bring them back into their body, back into present moment awareness, back into the felt sense of their own truth beneath all the mental activity. Without this grounding, Gemini can live entirely in the realm of ideas and concepts, brilliant and articulate but somehow hollow, connected to everyone and no one at the same time. I want you to understand something crucial here. If you're a Gemini sun, moon, or rising, or if you have Mercury in Gemini, or a stellium in the third house, you came into this life with a specific assignment. You are here to be a bridge. You are here to translate between different worlds, different perspectives, different ways of knowing. You are here to show people that multiplicity is not confusion, that holding paradox is not weakness, that changing your mind when you learn new information is not failure but evolution. But you cannot do this work if you're ashamed of your own nature. You cannot be an effective bridge if you're trying to be a monument. You cannot translate between worlds if you've collapsed yourself into one fixed identity to make others comfortable. Right now, in this moment of collective awakening, we need Gemini energy more than ever. We need people who can hold multiple perspectives without collapsing into relativism. We need people who can communicate across divides, who can find the common language between seemingly opposed positions. We need people who can think fast, adapt quickly, and help others navigate complexity without shutting down. But this requires Gemini to step into the mature expression of their gifts rather than the wounded expression. It requires doing the inner work to distinguish between healthy adaptation and self-abandonment. It requires learning when to use the gift of mirroring to create connection and when you're using it to hide. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like. Imagine a Gemini native in a conversation with someone who has very different political views. The immature Gemini might simply mirror those views back to avoid conflict, agreeing with everything to keep the peace. Then going to another friend and mirroring their opposite views. This creates the appearance of being two-faced because there's no core truth being expressed. But the mature Gemini does something completely different. They listen deeply to understand the underlying values and concerns beneath the political position. They ask questions that help the person articulate what they really care about. They find the points of genuine agreement while also being clear about where they differ. They create a space where multiple perspectives can coexist without anyone having to be wrong. This is not people-pleasing. This is sophisticated emotional and intellectual intelligence in action. The difference is presence. The difference is being grounded in your own truth while remaining open to others. The difference is using your gift of perspective taking to build bridges rather than to disappear. Have you noticed this pattern in your own life? The moments when your Gemini gifts feel like superpowers versus the moments when they feel like a curse. The times when your ability to see all sides helps you solve problems versus the times when it paralyzes you with indecision. This is the work. This is the edge. This is where Gemini energy either becomes a profound gift to the world or a source of personal suffering. And here's what almost no one tells you about Gemini. Beneath all the mental activity, beneath all the words and ideas and social performance, there is a deep longing for truth. Not singular truth, not dogmatic truth, but living truth. The kind of truth that can hold paradox. The kind of truth that evolves. The kind of truth that recognizes that reality is more complex and more beautiful than any single story can capture. Gemini is not actually interested in superficially. Gemini is interested in the full spectrum. They want to know how things work. Why people think what they think. What connects seemingly unrelated phenomena. The appearance of superficially comes from moving quickly across many topics. But this is actually breadth of curiosity, not shallowness. Think about it this way. Some signs go deep by drilling down into one subject for years. Gemini goes deep by understanding the connections between everything. Both are valid forms of depth. Both are necessary. But our culture tends to value the first and dismiss the second. Which means Gemini's form of intelligence is constantly undervalued. I want to talk about something that will completely shift how you understand Gemini's relationship with truth and authenticity. Because this is where the deepest misunderstanding lies. People accuse Gemini of being fake, of being a liar, of never showing their real self. But what if I told you that Gemini is actually one of the most honest signs in the Zodiac? Just not in the way we've been taught to recognize honesty. Here's what I mean. Most people think authenticity means being the same person in every situation, showing the same face to everyone, never adapting or changing based on context. This is actually a very fixed sign understanding of authenticity. It works beautifully for Taurus, for Leo, for Scorpio, for Aquarius. These signs have a strong sense of a core self that remains constant, and their authenticity comes from expressing that consistent self regardless of circumstances. But Gemini's authenticity works completely differently, and this is crucial to understand. Gemini's truth is that they contain multitudes. Their authentic self is not singular but plural. They are genuinely different people in different contexts, not because they're performing or lying, but because different situations activate different aspects of their consciousness. The version of you that shows up with your intellectual friends is real. The version of you that shows up with your family is real. The version of you that emerges when you're alone is real. They're all real. They're all you. This is not fragmentation. This is wholeness that includes multiplicity. Think about water for a moment. Water can be ice, liquid, or steam. Same molecular structure. Completely different expressions depending on temperature and pressure. Is ice being fake when it's not liquid? Is steam being inauthentic because it's not ice? No, they're all water, just responding to different conditions. This is Gemini. Same consciousness. Different expressions based on context, and all of them are true. But here's where it gets really interesting. And this is something I need you to sit with. Gemini has access to a form of truth that other signs often miss entirely. Because Gemini can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. They can see the truth that exists in the space between opposing viewpoints. They can perceive the meta pattern that emerges when you zoom out far enough to see how contradictory things are actually part of a larger coherent system. Let me give you a real example. I worked with a Gemini rising client who was in absolute agony because she couldn't choose between two career paths. She had spent 5 years building a successful career in corporate finance. But she was also deeply passionate about becoming a therapist. Everyone in her life was telling her to pick one. Her family said therapy was impractical. Her friends said she'd be wasting her finance degree. Her partner wanted her to just make a decision and stick with it. But here's what she eventually discovered. The truth wasn't either or. The truth was that she was being called to create something entirely new that integrated both. She ended up creating a financial therapy practice, working with people on the psychological and emotional dimensions of their relationship with money. This wasn't available to her when she was trying to choose between the two options. It only became visible when she stopped trying to collapse herself into a single path and instead asked what wanted to emerge from holding both. This is Gemini's genius. This is what they're here to teach us. The both and rather than the either-or. The third option that becomes visible only when you can hold the tension between two apparent opposites. But doing this requires something most people are terrified of. It requires living in uncertainty. It requires not knowing. It requires being comfortable in the liminal space. The threshold. The place where you haven't yet resolved into a single answer. And our culture hates this. Our culture demands immediate clarity. Quick decisions. Firm positions. We're taught that not knowing is weakness. That changing your mind is failure. That exploring multiple options is wasting time. Gemini knows this is nonsense. Gemini knows that the most important insights come from staying in the question long enough for something new to emerge. But the pressure to collapse into certainty before you're ready is immense. And this is where so many Gemini placements abandon their own process and make decisions that don't actually fit them. Have you done this? Have you forced yourself to choose before you were ready because everyone around you was uncomfortable with your uncertainty? Have you committed to a path, a relationship, identity before you fully explored what was true for you, just to stop people from calling you indecisive? This is one of the deepest wounds Gemini carries. The wound of being rushed. The wound of being told that your natural process of exploration and information gathering is a problem rather than a gift. And when Gemini operates from this wound, they either become paralyzed, unable to make any decision at all, or they make impulsive decisions just to escape the discomfort of not knowing, then change course later when they realize it wasn't right. The healing comes from learning to trust your own timing, from understanding that you'll need to gather information, to explore options, to see things from multiple angles before committing is not a flaw. It's due diligence. It's intelligence. It's how you make decisions that actually align with the full complexity of who you are. Now I want to address something that causes tremendous pain for Gemini placements. And that's the accusation of being superficial or unable to go deep. This one cuts because there's often a grain of truth in it. But not in the way people think. Gemini can absolutely struggle with depth. But not because they're incapable of it. They struggle with depth when they're using their mental agility as a defense mechanism against feeling. Here's what this looks like. Gemini is an air sign, which means they process reality through the mind, through concepts and ideas and language. When something painful or uncomfortable arises, the Gemini instinct is to think about it, to analyze it, to understand it intellectually. This can be incredibly useful. The ability to gain perspective on your emotions, to understand the patterns and stories that drive your reactions. This is valuable psychological work, but it becomes a problem when thinking about feelings replaces actually feeling them. When you can give a brilliant analysis of why you're sad, but you never actually let yourself cry. When you can explain the psychological origins of your anger, but you never let yourself express it. When you can articulate your fear with perfect clarity, but you never let yourself be vulnerable enough to be held in it. This is where Gemini's gift becomes a trap. The mind is so quick, so articulate, so good at creating distance through understanding, that it can keep you perpetually one step removed from your actual lived experience. You can talk about your life without ever actually being in your life. You can describe your feelings without ever feeling them. You can analyze your relationships without ever truly surrendering to intimacy. And here's the thing. People can feel this. They can sense when you're in your head rather than in your heart. They can tell when you're performing connection rather than actually connecting. This is what people mean when they say Gemini is superficial. They're not responding to your intelligence or your curiosity. They're responding to the energetic distance that comes from living in your mind rather than in your body and heart. The path forward for Gemini is not to stop thinking. That would be like asking a fish to stop swimming. The path forward is to bring the thinking into relationship with feeling, with sensation, with embodied presence. To let the brilliant mind serve the heart rather than protect it. To use language not as a way to avoid intimacy, but as a way to deepen it. I had a Gemini moon client who described this perfectly. She said, "I can tell you exactly why I'm afraid of commitment. I can't race it back to my childhood. I can explain the attachment patterns. I can give you a whole psychological framework. But none of that actually helps me feel safe enough to let someone in. The understanding doesn't create the healing. The healing comes from being willing to feel the fear in my body, to let myself shake and cry and be held in it. And my mind hates that because it can't control it. This is the work. This is the edge. This is where Gemini either becomes truly wise or remains cleverly defended. And I want to be clear about something. This is not about making Gemini wrong for being mental. Air signs are mental. That's their nature. That's their gift. The goal is not to become a water sign or an earth sign. The goal is to become a fully integrated air sign, where the mental brilliance is in service to the whole person rather than dissociated from it. When Gemini does this work, when they learn to drop from their head into their heart and body while maintaining their mental clarity, they become absolutely unstoppable. They become the person who can hold space for others' emotions without getting overwhelmed because they can think clearly even in the midst of intensity. They become the therapist, the teacher, the communicator who can translate complex emotional experiences into language that helps people understand themselves. They become the bridge between mind and heart, between intellect and intuition, between thinking and feeling. This is Gemini's highest expression, not choosing between head and heart, but integrating them, not abandoning the mind, but expanding beyond it, not stopping the thinking, but letting the thinking be informed by feeling and sensation and embodied knowing. Let me talk about Gemini in relationships, because this is where so much confusion and pain lives. Gemini gets accused of being unable to commit, of always having one foot out the door, of getting bored and moving on. And yes, this can absolutely be true when Gemini is operating from wounding. But when you understand what Gemini actually needs in relationship, everything shifts. Gemini doesn't fear commitment. Gemini fears stagnation. Gemini fears being locked into a fixed dynamic where growth and change are not allowed. Gemini fears relationships that demand they be the same person every day, that punish them for evolving, that require them to suppress their curiosity and their need for mental stimulation. When Gemini finds a partner who understands this, who sees their changeability as alevines rather than instability, who is curious about their many facets rather than threatened by them, Gemini can be incredibly loyal. Not the loyalty of never changing, but the loyalty of choosing to grow together, of staying in conversation, of remaining curious about each other even after years. The key is that Gemini needs a relationship that has space in it, space for both people to have their own interests, their own friendships, their own inner lives, space for conversation and exploration and learning together, space for both people to change and evolve without the relationship falling apart. Gemini also needs a partner who can match them intellectually, or at least someone who values intellectual connection. This doesn't mean you need to be an academic or an intellectual in the traditional sense. It means you need to be curious, willing to explore ideas, able to engage in real conversation rather than just small talk. Gemini can handle a lot of differences in a relationship, but they cannot handle mental boredom. They cannot be with someone who doesn't want to think, who doesn't want to question, who doesn't want to explore. And here's something crucial that often gets missed. Gemini needs verbal affirmation and communication in relationships. They need to hear that you love them, that you appreciate them, that you see them. They need conversation to feel connected. Silence might feel intimate to a water sign, but to Gemini, extended silence can feel like disconnection. They process connection through exchange, through dialogue, through the back and forth of ideas and feelings expressed in words. This doesn't mean Gemini can't learn to appreciate other forms of intimacy. They absolutely can. But if you're in relationship with a Gemini and you're wondering why they seem distant or disconnected, ask yourself when was the last time you had a real conversation. Not logistics, not small talk, but actual exchange of thoughts and feelings and ideas. Gemini comes alive in conversation. They feel seen and known through being heard and understood. Now let me address something that might be the most important piece of understanding Gemini energy. And this is about the relationship between Gemini and truth at the deepest level. We've talked about how Gemini holds multiple perspectives, how they can see all sides of a situation. But there's a shadow here that needs to be brought into the light because it's causing real suffering. When Gemini can see every side of every argument, when they can understand how each perspective has validity, they can lose touch with their own truth entirely. They become so good at seeing through other people's eyes that they forget they have their own eyes. They become so skilled at understanding why people believe that they stop asking what they themselves actually believe. This is different from the performance we talked about earlier. This is deeper. This is a kind of existential homelessness where Gemini becomes a mirror for everyone else, but has no reflection of their own. They can tell you what their mother thinks, what their partner thinks, what their boss thinks, what society thinks. But if you ask them what they think, there's just silence. Not because they're hiding, but because they genuinely don't know anymore. I've seen this with so many Gemini placements. And it's heartbreaking because it comes from such a beautiful impulse. Gemini wants to understand. They want to see clearly. They want to be fair and objective. But somewhere along the way, they confused objectivity with self-erasure. They thought that having their own strong opinion meant they were being biased or closed-minded. So they trained themselves out of having positions, out of having preferences, out of having a center. And here's what happens when you live like this. You become exhausted. You become anxious. You feel like you're constantly shapeshifted to meet other people's expectations. But you can't figure out why because you're not consciously trying to please anyone. You're just genuinely unsure what you want, what you think, what you feel. Because you've spent so long in other people's perspectives that you've lost the pathway back to your own. Does this land for you? Have you found yourself in conversations where you can argue any side brilliantly, but afterwards you realize you have no idea what you actually believe? Have you noticed that you can give advice to everyone else with perfect clarity, but when it comes to your own life, you're paralyzed by seeing too many options? The healing here is profound but challenging. It requires Gemini to do something that feels almost impossible at first. It requires them to choose, not forever, not rigidly, but to choose in this moment what feels true for them. Even knowing that it might change. Even knowing that other perspectives are also valid. Even knowing that they might see it differently tomorrow. This is not about becoming dogmatic. This is not about closing your mind. This is about learning that you can hold multiple perspectives and still have a center. You can understand why someone believes something different and still know what you believe. You can see the validity in opposing viewpoints and still take it and for what matters to you. Think of it like this. Imagine you're standing at the center of a circle, and all around you are different perspectives, different truths, different ways of seeing. The immature Gemini rise to stand in all the positions at once, which means they're actually standing nowhere. The mature Gemini stands firmly in the center, in their own truth, while being able to see and understand all the positions around them. They're not in those positions. They're not trying to be in those positions, but they can see them clearly from where they stand. This is the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between understanding and losing yourself, between intellectual flexibility and existential homelessness. And learning this difference is perhaps the most important work a Gemini placement will ever do. Let me tell you about the Gemini gift that almost never gets talked about. And this is going to shift something for you. Gemini has an extraordinary capacity for translation. And I don't just mean between languages, though many Gemini placements are naturally good at that too. I mean translation between different worlds of experience, different paradigms, different ways of knowing. Gemini can talk to the scientist and understand their framework. Then they can talk to the mystic and understand their framework. And here's the magic. Gemini can see how both are describing the same reality from different angles. They can find the connecting thread between quantum physics and ancient wisdom. They can bridge the gap between the rational and the intuitive. They can help people who speak completely different languages of experience actually understand each other. This is not a small thing. This is desperately needed in our world right now. We are so fragmented, so divided into camps and tribes and ideologies that can't communicate with each other. We need people who can move between worlds, who can translate, who can find the common ground without erasing the differences. This is Gemini's sacred work. But you can only do this work if you've done the inner work we've been talking about. If you're still performing, if you're still lost in other people's perspectives, if you're still using your mental agility as a defense against feeling, you can't be an effective bridge. You'll just be a mirror, reflecting back what people want to hear but not actually creating understanding. The mature Gemini translator stands in their own truth while being genuinely curious about others' truth. They ask real questions, not rhetorical ones. They listen to understand, not to formulate their response. They're willing to be changed by what they learn, but they're not dissolved by it. They bring their full self to the conversation, including their own perspective, while making space for perspectives that differ from their own. This is sophisticated consciousness. This is what the world needs from Gemini right now. Not more clever people who can argue any side of any issue. We have plenty of those. We need people who can hold space for complexity, who can help us see how things that seem contradictory might actually be complementary, who can find the synthesis that emerges when we stop trying to prove who's right and start trying to understand what's true. Now I want to talk about Gemini and creativity, because this is where some of the most exciting potential lives. Gemini is not traditionally thought of as one of the creative signs. That honor usually goes to Leo, to Pisces, to the signs associated with art and imagination. But Gemini has a form of creativity that's absolutely unique and incredibly powerful. Gemini creates through combination, through taking existing elements and putting them together in new ways, through seeing connections that others miss and using those connections to generate something that didn't exist before. This is the creativity of the inventor, the innovator, the person who looks at two completely unrelated fields and asks what would happen if we brought them together. Think about some of the most innovative thinkers and creators in history. Many of them had strong Gemini placements. They weren't necessarily the ones who went deep into one discipline and mastered every detail. They were the ones who moved between disciplines, who brought insights from one field into another, who created breakthroughs by making unexpected connections. This is Gemini's creative genius. Not the creativity of pure imagination, but the creativity of recombination, of synthesis, of seeing patterns across domains, and in our current moment, where the biggest challenges we face require interdisciplinary thinking, where the solutions will come from connecting different fields of knowledge. Gemini's form of creativity is more valuable than ever. But here's what Gemini needs to understand about their creative process. It doesn't look like other people's creative process. And that's okay. Gemini doesn't need to lock themselves in a room and focus on one project for months. That's torture for Gemini energy. Gemini creates through movement, through conversation, through exposure to many different inputs. They need to read widely, talk to diverse people, explore different subjects, because this is how they gather the raw material for their creative synthesis. The problem is that our culture valorizes the artist who suffers alone in their studio, who dedicates themselves to one craft for decades, who goes deep rather than wide, and Gemini tries to force themselves into this model and wonders why they feel dead inside. Your creative process is allowed to be different. Your genius is allowed to come from breadth rather than depth, from connection rather than isolation, from speed rather than slow contemplation. Trust your process. Trust that the seemingly random things you're interested in will connect in ways you can't predict yet. Trust that you'll need to move between projects, to explore multiple interests, to follow your curiosity wherever it leads. This is not distraction. This is how you create. Let me address something about Gemini and spirituality, because this is where some of the deepest misunderstanding lies. Gemini is often seen as too mental, too rational, too in their head to be truly spiritual. And yes, Gemini can absolutely get trapped in the mind, can use intellectualization as a defense against the mystery, can try to understand spirituality rather than experience it. But here's what people miss. Gemini has access to a form of spiritual experience that's completely valid and often overlooked. Gemini experiences the divine through connection, through communication, through the meeting of minds and hearts in conversation. When Gemini has a real conversation, when there's genuine exchange and understanding flowing between people, when new insight emerges from the dialogue that neither person had before. This is Gemini's spiritual experience. Gemini doesn't need to sit in silent meditation for hours, though they can certainly benefit from practices that quiet the mind. But their natural spiritual practice is dialogue, is inquiries and that, is the pursuit of truth through exchange with others. The Socratic method is a Gemini spiritual practice. When done with genuine curiosity rather than ego, is a Gemini spiritual practice. Teaching and learning in dynamic exchange is a Gemini spiritual practice. The divine speaks through conversation, through the moment when you're talking with someone and suddenly you both understand something you didn't understand before. Through the flash of insight that comes from hearing your own thoughts reflected back to you in someone else's words. Through the connection that happens when two minds meet in genuine curiosity and openness. This is not less spiritual than meditation or prayer or ritual. It's just different. It's the spirituality of the air element, of the mind in service to truth, of consciousness exploring itself through relationship and exchange. And here's something beautiful that happens when Gemini embraces this. They stop trying to be spiritual in ways that don't fit them. They stop forcing themselves into practices that feel deadening. They start to recognize the sacred in their natural way of being, in their curiosity, in their love of learning, in their gift for connection and communication. Your spirituality is allowed to be intellectual. Your path to the divine is allowed to be through the mind. You don't have to transcend thinking to reach truth. You can think your way into deeper truth, as long as you're thinking in service to genuine inquiry rather than in defense against the unknown. So let me bring this all together. Because if you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, you're ready to understand what Gemini is really here to teach us. Gemini shows us that reality is not singular but multiple. That truth is not fixed but evolving. That identity is not solid but fluid. That connection happens through exchange. That wisdom comes from holding paradox rather than resolving it, in a world that's increasingly polarized. That demands you pick a side and stay there. That punishes nuance and complexity. Gemini energy is revolutionary. Gemini refuses the false binary. Gemini insists that both things can be true. Gemini creates space for multiple perspectives to coexist without anyone having to be wrong. But Gemini can only do this sacred work when they've healed their own wounds. When they've learned to distinguish between healthy adaptation and self-abandonment. When they've found their own center while remaining open to others. When they've integrated their brilliant mind with their feeling heart and their sensing body. When they've learned to trust their own timing and their own process rather than collapsing under pressure to be more decisive, more consistent, more singular than they actually are. If you carry Gemini energy, Gemini energy, I want you to hear this. Your multiplicity is not a flaw. Your changeability is not weakness. Your need for variety and stimulation is not shallowness. Your ability to see all sides is not indecisiveness. These are your gifts. These are what you came here to offer. The world needs your flexibility, your curiosity, your ability to translate between different worlds, your capacity to hold complexity without shutting down. But you have to stop apologizing for who you are. You have to stop trying to be more like the fixed signs, more consistent, more predictable, more committed to a single path. That's not your medicine. Your medicine is movement, is exploration, is the willingness to change and grow and evolve. Your medicine is showing others that it's safe to not know, to explore, to hold multiple truths at once. The work is to do this from wholeness rather than wounding, to be grounded in your own truth while remaining open to others, To use your mental brilliance in service to connection rather than as protection from it. To let your many facets be expressions of a coherent whole rather than fragments of a fractal.